Hey there, and welcome back to The Explainer. If you're a focused learner looking to dig way past the daily headlines and uncover the deeper structures of our past, well, you are in the exact right place today. We're going to explore a totally paradigm-shifting piece of historical writing, Chapter 22 of Howard Zinn's famous book, A People's History of the United States. This chapter is titled The Unreported Resistance, and it absolutely challenges the traditional ways we're taught to look at modern American history.
Think about it. When you turn on your nightly news feed or read a standard history textbook, whose actions are usually front and center? Typically, it's the presidents, right? The corporate executives, the military generals. The mainstream narrative kind of implies that history is exclusively made by the powerful, and that ordinary citizens are just, passive observers. But what if that's literally only half the story? What if there's an entirely different reality happening on the ground, completely ignored by the cameras? Okay, let's dive into this. Howard Zinn's core thesis in this chapter is that right beneath the surface of official politics, there exists what he calls a permanent adversarial culture. He argues that despite the political consensus in Washington that keeps the status quo humming along, there are millions, perhaps tens of millions, of Americans who actively or even silently refuse to go along with it. Zinn documents this continuous, vibrant undercurrent of grassroots resistance that is almost entirely left out of the national media spotlight. Part 1. The permanent adversarial culture. And this brilliantly illustrates what Zinn frames as the overarching paradox of the modern era. It's this massive disconnect between the elite consensus and the actual on-the-ground reality. On one side, you've got the Washington Consensus, a bipartisan agreement across decades aimed at maintaining national military strength and keeping wealth and power firmly in the hands of a few. But on the other side, the unreported resistance. Zinn points out that because there was no massive, unified national movement, the media just assumed the public was compliant. But the reality was that thousands of local actions, strikes, and protests were happening everywhere, fueled by millions of alienated citizens. Now, just to ground this explainer real quick, before we look at specific examples, everything we're exploring today is drawn directly from the historical record as compiled in Zinn's monumental work. He's really forcing us to look away from the White House and instead look at the streets, the farmlands, and the factories to see how ordinary people were actually shaping their own destinies. Part 2. Defying the war machine. So, one of the most significant areas of this unreported resistance was how citizens systematically challenged the military-industrial complex. The source text details some incredibly dramatic, completely nonviolent protests against the nuclear arms race. For example, a tiny, determined group of Christian pacifists, including former priest Philip Berrigan and former nun Elizabeth McAllister, became pioneers here. They were arrested repeatedly for trespassing on restricted areas at the Pentagon and the White House during the Carter and Reagan years. They even went as far as pouring their own blood on symbols of the war machine. I mean, they were literally trying to call attention to the life and death stakes of nuclear proliferation. But it wasn't just a handful of individuals. Listen to this number, 1,800. That's how many people were arrested in Minneapolis, Minnesota alone between 1982 and 1988. What were they doing? Thousands of citizens were demonstrating year after year against the Honeywell Corporation and its massive military contracts. Think about that staggering scale of civil disobedience happening in just one Midwestern city, largely outside the purview of the national evening news. And what's really fascinating is how the broader public responded to these acts. Zinn highlights the case of the Winooski 44 back in 1984. These were Vermont citizens who refused to leave a U.S. senator's office hallway to protest his votes funding the Nicaraguan Contras. When they were arrested and brought to trial, they actually weren't treated as criminals by their peers. They found a sympathetic judge, and get this, an ordinary jury actually acquitted them. It proved that everyday people deeply understood and supported the moral cause behind technically breaking the law. Let's move to, and see how this builds, Part 3. Grassroots environmental justice. The resistance wasn't just about foreign policy either. It was heavily focused on the literal ground people lived on. Here's another mind-blowing number for you, 8,000. During the Reagan administration, housewife and activist Lois Gibbs formed the Citizens Clearinghouse for Hazardous Wastes. Zinn notes that this single organization provided help to 8,000 distinct local groups all around the country. People were waking up to the fact that their immediate environments were being poisoned, and they were organizing to stop it. The sheer geographic diversity of these victories is just incredible. In Oregon, citizens launched successful lawsuits forcing the EPA to act on unsafe drinking water in the Bull Run Reservoir. Down in Tift County, Georgia, 300 African Americans successfully protested a chemical plant that was actively making them sick. Over in Cherokee County, North Carolina, Native Americans organized to stop a polluted landfill on their land.
These were rapid-fire, localized victories happening everywhere, completely bypassing the media's narrative of a passive public. Part 4. Labor and anti-poverty organizing. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer diversity of the populations mobilizing for economic justice. This push for human dignity extended deeply into the workplace and the community. You've got the Piedmont Peace Project in North Carolina, organized by the daughter of a mill worker, creating this powerful multiracial network of low-income women, textile workers, and maids. You have the historic Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, acting as a hub for activist education. Out west, Chicano farm workers, led by Cesar Chavez, were organizing massive national grape boycotts against feudal working conditions. And on the West Coast, groups like Food Not Bombs were defying authorities, facing repeated arrests simply for distributing free food to the poor without a license. We even saw this impulse to resist totally revitalized, stagnant, old institutions. In 1991, the rank-and-file workers of the massive Teamsters Union actually staged an internal rebellion. They voted out their notoriously corrupt leadership, replacing them with a reform slate that immediately began pushing for independent political coalitions. The spirit of democracy and defiance was sparking literally everywhere you looked. Part 5. The Battle of Seattle. So all of these seemingly isolated actions were quietly building a foundation, climaxing in 1999. Let's walk through how this escalated. The World Trade Organization, a massive symbol of global corporate power, was holding a summit in Seattle. Step 1. Tens of thousands of citizens, environmentalists, labor unionists, human rights activists, gathered in the streets. And as Zinn documents, the overwhelming majority were completely nonviolent. Step 2. The police responded with intense aggression, using tear gas and jailing hundreds, while the media disproportionately focused on a tiny fraction of window breakers. But step 3 is the real payoff. The protests were so massive and disruptive that the official WTO talks actually collapsed. To give this historic, triumphant moment a visceral voice, listen to this quote from Mike Brannon, an insurgent Teamster who was actually there. He wrote, "The kind of solidarity that all of us dream of was in the air as people sang, chanted, played music, and stood up to the cops and the WTO. The people owned the streets that day, and it was as much a lesson for us as it was for corporate America. It was just a stunning realization of collective power." Part 6. The impulse to resist. So the crucial point is bringing all these hidden movements back to Zinn's overarching philosophical thesis. Why does this history actually matter? Well, it's captured beautifully right here. Zinn writes that uncovering this history reminds us of the enormous capacity of apparently helpless people to resist, of apparently contented people to demand change. He essentially argues that uncovering these stories reveals a powerful, ubiquitous human impulse to assert one's humanity. Even in times of deep pessimism, when the establishment seems entirely secure, people constantly stir and rise up. I want to leave you with a really powerful question to think about today. Consider your daily media consumption, what gets left out of your nightly newsfeed. And maybe, more importantly, as you look at this hidden history of ordinary people changing the world, what is your own capacity for surprise and your own capacity for resistance? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.